Hello and welcome to our event on Russia-Japan unbalanced relations, expectation and reality from Abe to Suga. I'm Matthew Rojansky. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. I want to thank everybody for joining us for what's now the second installment of our Global Perspectives series, taking a look at Russia and its relations with third countries all around the world. So today, of course, we're going to look at Russia and Japan. Tomorrow, we'll feature a discussion at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Egypt-Russia relations with Tarek Osman and my colleague here at the Wilson Center, Marissa Kurma. Now I want to especially thank my colleague Shihoko Goto for co-hosting today's event, as well as the Wilson Center's Asia program for its co-sponsorship. Before I start, I'd like to remind you can stay up to date with our upcoming events and publications on our website, as well as our podcasts, which are on Apple Podcasts or any place you listen. And they're called Kennan X, and our newest podcast, The Russia File. You can also find written analysis of events in Russia and the region on our publication platforms, The Russia File and our Focus Ukraine blog, as well as our Kennan Cable series. All of them are clever references, of course, to the life and work of George F. Kennan, Mr. X, the Cable, etc. And in fact, our Kennan Cable series will feature an analysis by Dr. Iwashita, whom I will introduce in just a moment this month. So stay tuned for that. As I promised, I'll introduce Dr. Iwashita, then I'll introduce Shihoko Goto. I'll let them speak to open, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. I just want to flag now, and I'll remind you again, that at any time you have a program, go ahead and email kennan@wilsoncenter.org. That's KENNAN at wilsoncenter.org. You can tweet to @Kennan Institute, or you can post a question on our Facebook page, and I will simply say, if you include a name and affiliation with your question, it makes it far more likely that we'll be able to read it out. So with no further ado, Dr. Akihiro Iwashita is the director of the Slavic Eurasian Research Center at Hokkaido University, where he currently teaches courses on border studies, Russian foreign policy, and Eurasian international relations. His research focuses on the development of the Russian economy, with a special emphasis on macroeconomic growth and structural changes, as well as the Russian Far East and Japanese-Russian relations. Dr. Iwashita received his SJD and LLB in political science from Kyushu University and his LLM in international law from Kitakyushu University. Dr. Iwashita has previously spoken at the Kennan Institute on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and participated in Kennan Institute conferences on the evolution of Slavic studies and the Meso-area approach. We're very grateful to have Dr. Iwashita with us today and to rekindle our partnership with Hokkaido University's Slavic Eurasian Center. Now I'll introduce Shihoko Goto, and then I'll turn the floor over to the two of you directly. Shihoko is the Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and the Senior Northeast Asia Associate at the Wilson Center's Asia program. She's a leading expert on economics and politics in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, as well as US policy towards the region. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Shihoko was a correspondent for Dow Jones News Service and United Press International, based in Tokyo and in Washington. She holds an MA in International Political Theory from the Graduate School of Political Science at Waseda University, Japan, and a BA in Modern History from Trinity College at the University of Oxford in the UK. So one more reminder, email questions to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet @Kennan Institute, or post on Facebook, and please include your name and affiliation. So with no further delay, Dr. Iwashita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone, from good evening country. So I'm happy to back to the Kennan place, and today I will say hello to everyone, old friend and new friend. Just I start today's presentation. I wish you look at my presentation here, the Japan-Russian unbalanced relations. So the new Prime Minister Suga had a general speech at Japan Diet yesterday. But in its foreign policy speech, Russia's priority is not so higher. It puts in a fifth row. First, at the North Korean issue, particularly abduction issue. So secondly, the US-Japan alliance. Third, in Asia, ASEAN, in the Southeast Asian relations. Fourth, it's China, big country for Japan. Then fifth, Russia comes just before 6 South Korean issue. But the Prime Minister Suga made emphasis South Korea as a very, very, very important neighbors, but he never said about Russia then. For Russia, Suga put the priority, of course, Northern Territory issue. Northern territorial issue for Japan is very important, but now in the process of frank talks. Frank talks means that kind of no progress for the negotiation. So why such kind of attitude Suga conducted? So my question and answers. Does the Suga administration have a realistic approach with Russia? Of course, no. Now, why not? Because former Prime Minister Abe has exhausted his approach with no result, rather worse than before. What another situation? I think geopolitics around Northeast Asia must shift because Japan wants to invite Russia for his side to counter the China. But from my opinion, little hope for splitting Russia-China ties. Later, I'll back to this point, but firstly, I say something geopolitics realities of our regions. If you look out the globe, that's kind of we share the globe, but we look at different views in different ways. Then most of you lived in Washington, D.C., you think of the geopolitics like this kind of map, that the United States between Atlantic and Pacific. The Russia and China belongs to different sides. Of course, in Moscow, in the light, Beijing, the west, and that means that Northeast Asia. But for us, Japan-centered map, we think that kind of. So Moscow a bit far from Tokyo, but Russia and China neighbors, it's very critical to our interest. United States is the most reliable ally, but in geopolitical sense, it's kind of far. It means that US and Japan sometimes have different view on interest and geopolitics of the region. This is the starting point. So how we connect this, our interest? We think every time, but sometimes it's not so easy. But for Japan, Russia-China relations more and more impacted. I think I want to say that point. Please look at these region realities. Japan, South Korea, China. It's a trade volume 2017 before COVID-19. So after COVID-19, everything changed, but you can imagine what kind of relation we shared in Northeast Asia. The Russia, South Korea, China, it's a kind of a charter. The Japan, China, South Korea, China, it's a great axis of economic volume. And in Japan, South Korea is good. Also, Japan, China is also, Russia, China is also good. But in concerning Russia, Japan, Russia, South Korea is a very, very low substance in economic trade. How about people's flow? Of course, under the current situation, people's flow is a very tightened. But if you look at this charter, it's very interesting. In Northeast Asia, these 4 countries sphere, the Japan and South Korea, people's flow almost 50%. China is a bigger country in 30%. Of course, other 70% is people's flow, the different area. Russia, very small. It means the Russia realities in the Northeast Asia, small presence. And of course, Japan, Russia, and Japan, South Korea, Russia, it's a very, very few people's flows. But if you put the China factor in this area, it's a kind of different images. So many Russia, China's strong ties. It suggests that Northeast Asia reality has Russia needs China so much. Without China, Russia's presence in the region is very small. This is a reality that I also illustrated before today's main topic, Japan-Russian relations. The second topic that in the Cold War period, the many conflictual zones, conflicts, they concentrated in the middle tiers of continental Eurasia. But after the Cold War period, it changes because China-Russia's great ties, they solve the border disputes at all, and also now it's a very good tide friendship. So the question is that Russia-China alliance, what is that? So from the beginning, I say that kind of Japan want to spirit ties between Russia and China. Basically, it's based on so-called Professor Boborov's thesis on strategic tension, Russia-China relation, axis of inconvenience, Russia-China. So, but even now we have 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but Russia-China solidarity is upward. This is the realities. Particularly first points, the new Cold War mentality in Russia against the United States. I'm very shocked in the Russian new constitution, revival of term of peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence was a reflection of the Cold War period. Now it's come back. This is we share the realities of the particularly perception context. Secondly, I dare to China maybe as a natural partner for Russia. Shrinking of the Atlantic window in Russia after Ukraine crisis, China must be essential for Russia's survival and revival. Finally, this is a point also I should highlight. Why, nevertheless, they refuse a term of alliance? I think this is not necessarily distrust between them. Rather, they love more independence. So in Russian, Jeljava, it loves Chanko in Chinese. It means that they do not like to depend on others for security. So these values they share, I think this is a really cross both country, but they do not use the term of alliance. The Russia's perception on China is very, very up now. So recently I checked the kind of data. What country is a military threat? United States, 40%, China 1%. What country is friendly to Russia? China 60%, United States 2%. What country is unfriendly to Russia? Of course, United States 67%, China 1%. What country does Russia share the common sense of mutual understanding? Amazing. China as a third place after Belarus and Kazakhstan. So please tell me why you don't recognize China as a natural partner to Russia. I want to listen to your criticism on me. And we back to the geopolitical axis. So after the Cold War period, the conflictual zone shifted up and down in the maritime zone. So then you look at Japan is a very critical position surrounding the maritime zone, narrow economical zone. So Japan had northern territory issue with Russia, in a Dr. Takeshima issue with South Korea, also problem with China on the Senkaku Delta. So we naturally think about to diffuse northern territories issue with Russia. It's very good for us. Okay, first part on presentation is closed. So it means that Japan's Russia push, too much China and too little Russia. Japan needs Russia. Maritime situation, Japan want to have Russia to balance others. And also North Korea nuclear weapons missile issue, Japan want something from Russia. However, Japan's red line, constance policy, settling the northern territories, this is a must for starting point. Okay, realities of Abe's foreign policy. I can categorize three parts. First, it's a foreign policy like sushi conveyor belt. It means that if you stay at the premier for a long time, you can travel anywhere. So you can easily take a diplomacy in a panoramic perspective of the world. Secondly, priorities, alliance, G7 like that. But today I pass it. Third, Russia is a mission. This is today's topic. What is a mission policy? It means excludes foreign ministry. Why they exclude our foreign services? Because our Japan's foreign services know what Putin is, who Putin is. Well, Putin keeps a harder position toward Japan on northern territory issues. It's kind of we share. Therefore, from Abe's views, our foreign ministry that didn't work well for northern territory issues. Rather, they might sabotage, like they block out the orientation. Then Abe rely on his aides based on Mechi. It means that Takaya Imai is Abe's first secretary and advisor. So if you remember our claims of territories, so 4 islands, Fukunashiri, Shikotan, Habomais, they should belong to Japan, but white place, of course, Japan and Russia didn't have a treaty, peace treaty. Therefore, the other parts, Northern Kuril and the South Saharan, yet officially be recognized by Japan, like we use this map officially. From Russian views, of course, in all of the Kurils belong to Russia. Therefore, they put their name and they use this kind of map. All of the Iturufu, Kunashiri, Shikotan, Habomai should belong to Russia. They, of course, claim that. Then here is a point of the borders, Japan's edge, Nemuro City, near in like another territories, Habomais. Key questions: how to solve the island sovereignty then? Japan claims 4 islands back to Japan. It's basically the Russians want zero option. But the good idea on the base 1956 Japan-Soviet declaration after peace treaty, Russia would hand transfer Habomai, Shikotan, 2 islands for Japan. So this is a kind of a negotiation under the Abes. So, but in parallel with sovereignty issue, how to care Japan's former islanders, how to develop and use territorial water and economic zones, and finally, it's also very, very key and treaty consistent with US-Japan alliance or not. So such kind of hurdles they face. But reality is mission. So how many Abes visit Russia? It's 11. The Abe's 7 years more period, he went to China and Korea, South Korea, 2-3 times only. I think that India 3 times, Mongolia same. But it's Russia, it's 11 times. It's amazing visiting numbers, probably following the United States. And skipping our foreign services sovereignty first approach. So the Abe administration official readiness, economic first approach with 2 islands plus alpha, they want to proceed. So 2016, then the Abe, Shinzo, and Shin want to move the approach, so-called new approach for the Northern Territory issues. So this year, Sochi, Vladivostok, Putin and Abe met. They have very good conversation for economic cooperation. As far as Abe told that economy, Putin smiled. Then we had so many good mood in the press on Japan. Shikotan, Habomai could come back. John Rural Kunashi Petrov would be possible. It's a very romantic idea, but we are very, very fashioned. But before coming to Japan, December, Putin said that on our press, Japan thinks territory issue, but we don't. No basis for transfer of Kunashiri. Of course, joint declaration mentioned the transfer of Shikotan, Habomai to islands, but nothing about concrete condition. Further negotiation are must. finally China is the number one partner, more important than Japan. Like a reporter, I fly to the place of meeting in Yamaguchi, hometown for Abe Shinzo, the meeting with Putin. Then December 15, then Yamaguchi, so many media like a festival, but Putin cooled down 3 hours delay as he always did. 90 minutes talk face to face there, but no progress on territorial issues, just frank talks over the peace treaty issue. That's it. So I back to the Tokyo for the kind of the TV program live to look at the Putin and Abe's joint press conference. So no joint statements, no concurrent results, no word on the territorial disputes. So I'm very shocked. What did he do? So I conclude soon in a couple minutes. Putin's policy reaction, I again said non-existence of territorial dispute for Russia. Japan, the loser, accept results of World War II. Joint declaration just as a basis for peace treaty and no non-conditional transfer. So from December 2016 now on, so what's progress? Factually no progress, just Vladivostok 2018, the Economy Eastern Forum. So Abe asked Putin to make more endeavor to sign peace treaty. Then Putin reacted, if you want more, okay, peace treaty, but without any condition. Japan's very shocked. We would lose 2 islands. Then Singapore in 2018 November, Abe say that, okay, that's okay, only 2 islands, etoro fukunashiri, no ever. But Putin never consented. Okay, that's good. We discuss a condition for transfer. United States would be deployed on territory. What do you do? So finally, Japan never accept that condition. So Putin says that, okay, you are not independent. You don't have independent decision for security. So I think that Putin does not like non-Java states. So 2019, what happened? Lavrov, foreign minister, is a very, very, very harsh comment on Japan. As the Japan citizen, it's kind of a shame. He says, do not distort Singapore agreement, accept World War II result as a loser, no more calls for Japan, Northern Territories. You drop it, Northern Territory term. Finally, no US in the islands. Then my conclusion is that no hope in the future. So the conclusion is ending the myth of return for islands, ending Northern Territories movements, and no alternative plan. It means that Suga, even he says that resolving the Northern Territory is a good, necessary for Japan, factually, he does not want to do anymore because of the just failures. So several years ago, I was invited to the Ballet Club. Fortunately, someone took a photo in the Putin and me. This is the back of Putin. It's very rarely show. But we look at Putin in the front, then he smiled, but I did not smile. But we, Japan and the United States researchers should think together on how Putin think on the back and what back of the Putin. This is today's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Iwashita. I'm reminded by the description, the quite dismaying, especially from the standpoint of Tokyo, description of this sort of hopeless policy, which is nonetheless an obsession. I guess I would say it's not only Japanese leaders who do that. But let me pass the floor to my colleague Shihoko for a comment on this, and then we'll open up the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matt. And Professor Iwashita, thank you very much for that comprehensive analysis of what Suga's challenges will be regarding its relations with Russia. I want to make two points, really, just to articulate a little bit about what you said about Abe bypassing, circumventing the foreign ministry and really getting more power to determine foreign policy. That's really been a notable hallmark of the Abe government. And regardless of whether you have been a supporter or not of his strategic vision and implementation of policies, certainly one of the hallmarks of the Abe government has been that it put Japan into, he strove to put Japan into a higher position of influence in the international community. And that was not just in foreign policy, but also in particular in trade policy as well. One of the Achilles heel of Abe had been his difficulties in reconciling with the historical baggage of Japan, both during World War II and before that. And we see that especially coming to the forefront in Japan's continued tempestuous relations with Korea, but also it could be argued that it was an Achilles heel for Abe regarding Russia as well, that there had been this overemphasis on trying to move forward from its history, trying to reach a peace agreement, trying to have reclaim lost territories during World War II. Without perhaps seeing what the bigger strategic vision of Japan's relations with Russia moving forward in the future might be. So that brings me to the issue of Prime Minister Suga. We say that Suga is very much has adopted a lot of the policies of the Abe administration. He's adopted a lot of the personnel, certainly, and he's, as you said at the beginning, he's outlined some of this, the high points of what Japan wants to achieve, and the order does not, perhaps it's not the correct way for Japan to approach its foreign policy vision, but it certainly is something that is reflective of the Abe government. But that said, when it comes specifically to Japan's future relations with Russia, Suga does not have that emotional tie as much, the personal drive to move forward on reclaiming the Northern Territories, perhaps from a personal emotional perspective. So can he perhaps have a more realist approach in dealing with Russia? I ask that because he can actually see what the challenges will be for Japan in the changing geopolitical landscape. But at the same time, even if he has that will to take on a different approach, perhaps not focus so much, be able to shelve the issue of territorial dispute. Of course, Japan has territorial disputes, not just with Russia, but with Korea, with China as well. The idea of territorial disputes is very much alive in the Asia Pacific, and Japan is part of that. But can Suga kind of overcome some of the obstacles that were put by Abe and focus much more on shelving the Northern Territory issue, not be so focused on having economic incentives to bring Russia to the table, and to have a better strategic approach, given that here in this country, we are going to have an election. There may or may not be a change in American leadership, but just like the United States is, there is bipartisan support both from the Democrats and the Republicans to take on a stronger approach to China. There is also this bipartisan US approach to see China increasingly as the security threat. And that threat actually is not actually shared as much with Japan. But is there a possibility for a greater alignment of how Japan may view China, may view Russia, and allow it to play a greater role in stabilizing a very tumultuous region?
Yeah, thank you very much, Yahoko. Those are, quite frankly, many of the questions that I had in my mind. Before we continue with our portion of the discussion, I want to remind folks we've got questions coming in, but you can add more to the mix. Email kennan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet @Kennan Institute, or post on our Facebook page and include your name and affiliation. Let me start with, I fully understand that this is maybe challenging one of the central premises of Japan's policy towards Russia for decades, now the better part of a century. But can I ask it this way, as an ignorant and unfamiliar outsider to this relationship, why do the islands have to be the gateway issue for everything else? Why can't this be an issue that is compartmentalized, as in so many relationships? And I just, if I can, again, not being an insider to East Asian politics, I would suggest it seems to me that as between Tokyo and Beijing, there are a great many issues that are effectively compartmentalized while the two pursue mutually beneficial cooperation. Why can't it work that way with respect to the islands issue with Russia? Professor.
Okay, now I return. So thank you for the questions. Your question is related is the Goto-san, and because the how we Japan think of history of foreign policies, this is very important. Not only the bilateral relations. When Japan was defeated by World War II, what Japan did to recover the relations with countries, some countries was the enemy, some countries others, some countries ex-colonials. So, but if you closely look at the Japan's foreign policy from the end of World War II, so two countries remains in the context. Of course, we had good ties with the United States. We rehabilitated the relations with China in 70s. Also 65 we had good ties with the Southeast Asia. Of course, Korea at the same time. But the North Korea and Soviet Union, this is a kind of whole of our foreign policies. Without the normalization, there was two countries, Japan never be back to the normal position. So Premier Nakasone and Premier Koizumi, you remember what did they do, particularly Koizumi, he wanted to have good relations and try with North Korea. Of course, he did something with Russia at the beginning. So in this sense, this kind of the mission, the big premier in Japan take a law to rehabilitating these two countries. This is a starting point. In Russia, Soviet Union, it's also in a sense of post-World War II process. So now we had only territorial issues with Russia. But if we back to the post-war process, United States had Ogasawara, Okinawa, and even sometimes Amami Islands. So Japan tried to get its own territories back as Japan did possibly. So most of the issues are solved, but dispute problem with Soviet Union remained. When we back to the history, the process of negotiation 1956, Japan tried to have a peace treaty then, but failed. Then joint declaration, and after peace treaty, Soviet Union would transfer to islands. This is the result. But then both countries, Soviet and Japan, tried to have a peace treaty ending the war. So the non-territorial issues, when now we focus only at that point, on only the Russia-Japan relations we look at. But it's in the post-war process of Japan's back to the world. Then final issue is in particularly territory Japan. It's a northern territory issues. Of course, 2 islands, 4 islands, other options we can discuss. I mean that, therefore, this is a very, very important issue, even only Russian context. I will return more questions to the Suga, and but later I'm back. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Did you want to comment on that as well, Shoko?
Yeah, just one specific thing about where we find ourselves today and moving forward on these territorial disputes that are so pervasive. It is an emotional issue that doesn't necessarily reflect the geopolitical, strategic endgame. And as we see a rise in nationalism across the region and indeed across the world, I think this issue about territorial disputes will only take on even greater significance. And one thing about Suga is that he is not only a newly appointed prime minister, he has become prime minister without going through the election process. He does need to call an election within the next 12 months. And if he is seen to back down on something as emotionally and politically charged as the territorial dispute with Russia, then it would really be a political negative for him. So that's something we should really bear in mind.
I'm going to enjoy my prerogative of asking kind of off-the-wall questions and add one more, which is, you may have noticed over the past several years as the US-Russia relationship has continued to deteriorate, and in particular, as the US-Russia dialogue has basically ended. There's just really no official dialogue. There are incidental meetings between the two presidents sometimes, no proper summits, no normal diplomatic contact, and very limited security contact. Some US allies have stepped into the breach, notably Germany and Israel, with, I would say, pretty limited results. In fact, in some cases, pretty disastrous results. In attempting to try to be go-betweens, if you will, for Washington and Moscow. Dare I put Japan on that list of a potential go-between for Washington and Moscow as a neighbor of Russia, an American ally, one of the world's top economies, and of course, very much in the crosshairs of the worsening security situation in the Pacific? Is it crazy to think Japan could play that role or would want to play that role as an intermediary?
Back to the last questions. Thank you for the recognizing Japan as a very good position. But factually, as I told before, Russia, with regret, recognize Japan as classic meaningful power because of we do rely on the United States for security issues. So if this is a very, very big if the Japan became more independent for security, probably Russia consider Japan a bit different way. But the problem is that Japan's choice relations with United States, more deep mutual dependence. So I think that in this sense, Japan's role is kind of mediator that doesn't make a sense. But I hope the Japan try to do such kind of orientation in context of the more balanced US-Japan alliance. And back to the Shihok-san, the concerning nationalism, Northern Territory issue has been long time issues in contrast with China, particularly China. So the territorial issues and nationalisms boom even now in only China, of course, some Korea. But for Russia, not so strong. Therefore, Abe Shinzo decide to get only 2 islands, leaving Etorov big islands for Russia. But most of the population can accept this decision if Putin agrees. This is my guess. The Abe's control and policy to 2 islands getting Japan, even to give up Etorov. I think that our people, of course, some people criticize that from the nationalist views, like some right-wing papers, but I think that most of the people accept that. The miscalculation for Abe's administration, just small things, but big things. Putin did not agree to the deal. So in a concept of nationalism framework, Northern Territory is not so issue. Therefore, if Suga want to do something, he can. But 2 island offer is difficult to be accepted by Putin. And one more thing that what Suga will do, this is a simple question for me, because back to pre-Abe period. I remember the 2010 or 9, 11, before Abe came back. So our foreign policies had a very prudent direction. Japan kept claims 4 islands, But in parallel, Japan tried to develop ties with Russia in any sense, in any economic or the securities or cultural. So Japan never gave up 4 islands, but develop ties with Russia. I think it was very reasonable, rational, but Abe changed the policy at all. We can't be back 4 islands. This is a challenge for us. Thank you.
It's very interesting if I can observe there. You know, I can't help as someone who studies the opposite end, the Western end of the former Soviet Union and Eurasia. I see so many parallels. You know, for example, in the dispute over Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, there are these theoretical arguments, very intense fights within the Western camp. You know, Ukrainians themselves, and Poles and Germans and Americans and Baltic nations all have a very strong opinion about what should or should not be on the bargaining table. The fact of the matter is, unless or until Mr. Putin is prepared to accept any compromise, there's no bargain. It's an academic discussion. And the dynamic of this reminds me very much of what you've described. And I think it underscores the position that the Kremlin likes to be in, which is to hold the kind of final decision-making power or veto, if you will, and to sort of let everybody else struggle to come up with proposals, and they simply have the option to say, yeah. If I could bring you in, Shihoko, I want to add another question. You're welcome to comment on this as well. But you may have read that in the last week at Valdai, which is his kind of favored platform for making pronouncements like this, Putin, for the first time, and this was, I think, very intentional, did begin to speak about a possible Russia-China military alliance. I think with what I know about the Russian system, it's very unlikely he would have done that without having had some conversations with his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, beforehand. It doesn't mean that they're announcing such an alliance, but that they have essentially both agreed to kind of float with the publics and the wider world, how would this be perceived? And this would be a very smart way of doing that. My question, of course, is if that's the way the wind is blowing, and there are so many signs for so long that it has been, despite what Professor Iwashita said about the priority that both sides have on like independence of action and not tying themselves down, that's very true. To what degree is that a game changer for Japan, a country which would physically find itself, I mean, in effect, hemmed in by two enormously powerful then military allies and rivals of the U.S.-Japanese alliance? What do you make of that? Shihoko, I'll go to you on that first.
That's really interesting. As we have kept repeating during this conversation, the region is in flux. There's a great deal of not just rivalry, but also tension and a lot of changes in the dynamics and relationships between countries in the region. The challenge for Japan, especially over the last 4 years, but even before that, has been a greater unwillingness for the United States to be as strong a Pacific power as it had been. And we've seen new permeations of partnerships. And we had seen under the Trump administration the evolution of an initiative that had initially been launched by Prime Minister Abe himself during his first term in office, namely a bigger outreach to what's called the Indo-Pacific strategy of free and open Indo-Pacific. But that hadn't really materialized as much, and it was seen much more as an offset against China's Belt and Road Initiative. What we are seeing now, though, in terms of security alliances, is a growth in the Quad, which is Japan, Australia, the United States, and India. And so we're having, and that is a security front. And I would think that the Quad evolution, regardless of whether there is a continuation of the Trump administration or a new Biden administration, the Quad is expected to continue to flourish. And so Japan would really be incentivized to bring in those partners, and especially to reach out to India as well as to Southeast Asia as well.
Professor Iwashita, do you want to comment on the Russia-China alliance issue? And then I do want to pivot and bring in some of our audience questions.
Just one, the reply. I think that the military technical cooperation would be a deep more and probably quasi-alliance like. But the issue is that they do not want to become under others' authority, command. So in the military sense, how keep the even relations, equal relations? I think it's a very serious discussion. Both of them do not want to be under others, the command. This is the first point. Secondly, a geopolitical asymmetry also problem, because Russia basically look at the European front, Atlantic front, but China pay much more in Pacific, Northeast Asians. This kind of asymmetry is also some problem. So therefore, if they work for becoming allied orientation, it takes much more time.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct, and I certainly did not mean to imply that we're going to have a North Pacific Treaty Organization or something announced by China and Russia anytime soon. Okay, let me go now quickly to audience questions. I realize I've taken up too much time selfishly with my own. First, Rosemary Griffin, who's the managing editor of Russia Commodities and Energy News S&P Global, asks, how do you expect the recent change in government in Japan to impact Russia-Japan energy links? Do you think the new government will look to increase energy cooperation with Russia? Are there any priority areas for energy cooperation? So who wants to tackle that one first? And if we keep our answers fairly brief, I'll be able to get through all of them.
Very simply, the Abe's ending means that the Meiji-based orientation endings. So we now know the power of Meiji economy, the ministry is down. It means that it could be a cooperation with Russia. The energy cooperation could be down if it worked in the strategically. But in economically, it makes sense. Nevertheless, I think that it would work. So it depends on the less political, more beneficial.
Shihoko, do you want to comment on the energy question?
Well, just one thing, two things really. The environmental concerns, Japan is really trying to promote itself as a carbon neutral country. And so how that will impact energy imports will be, that will be a big consideration. Let me leave it at that.
Yeah, I recall reading this morning, carbon neutral by 2050 or something like that,
Right.
the Suga government. Yeah, so this definitely runs counter. I'm fairly certain that Russia is not exporting any green energy at this point. So John Stephen, who's an emeritus professor at the University of Hawaii, asks, most Western observers, including some leading specialists, have publicly declared the Northern Territories can and will be solved. For example, Henry Kissinger said by 1991. I guess that was not correct. Any thoughts on what might sustain such optimism over the course of 7 decades, despite our conversation? Professor Iwashita, I think that one's to you.
I think that it's a very challenging to me. But if Japan retract less islands demand position, I think that some possibility. We fix the 2 island back option, but the islands not one, and it could be cut half and half, not half and half more. Of course, in Habomai, it's islets, it's small groups. So if we have some idea to seek the different format, but it's less than 2 islands. Theoretically, it could be, but I think that the current situation, the Japan government never look forward to this more complex, more concession orientation. So it means that no progress.
Shihoko, any comment on why the optimism among Westerners? And I have to concede, I myself wrote a foolishly optimistic article back in 2015 on the assumption that Russia would be so interested in trade normalization with Japan while it suffered from sanctions from Europe and the United States that it would go for the deal. And I was, of course, completely wrong. Shihoko, no? Okay. All right. Well, let me take one last question here, and then we'll wrap. This actually comes from David Wolf at Hokkaido University, also a former Wilson Center scholar in the Cold War International History Project. He says, Dr. Iwashita, in commenting on why Russia and China don't call their relationship an alliance, implies that security issues are not the main part of their relations. But what about Russian arms sales and Russian participation in military maneuvers in the South China Sea near Taiwan, around the Senkaku Islands in recent years? Isn't this encouraging China's aggressive behavior in the region? In a strategic triangle, wouldn't it be in Russia's interest to encourage Chinese friction with the US? And if I can add to that, it's a two-way street. I recall within the last year and a half, 2 years, China sent a flotilla to the Baltic Sea to participate in exercises with Russia. I mean, I found that shocking as someone who watches that part of Europe, to suddenly find Chinese military power showing up at Russia's invitation.
I'm not necessarily against this idea. I accept these realities, but they're concerning the term of alliance. I hesitate to use that even in toward alliance. So I'm thinking why both countries do not want to have alliance. So I think this is a very state how to say is what states we are. This is a very key stance for their stateship. Of course, in the technically and their more tactical context, I believe that, as David suggests, that both countries more cross to cooperate anywhere in the world.
Maybe, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to ask one final question for both of you. It's again somewhat speculative, but I wonder, would it again be over-optimistic, perhaps out of ignorance on my part, to think that the clear drive from Pyongyang to deploy a world-threatening ballistic missile capability, the latest missile being a very good example, that it might bring maybe not a complete revolution, but a realignment around the North Korea problem, so that both Russia and China, for their part, and the US and Japan and South Korea too, might come seriously, especially, I don't want to get political here, but especially after November 3rd, if there is a different administration in Washington. I mean, could you see North Korea as a sort of come together opportunity for what is starting to look like a new, Cold War type dynamic in East Asia?
I think that there is a very interesting story. However, even the Pyongyang has a capability to push us together. The policy aims, policy intention is also clear. They not necessarily against Russia and China so much, but to us. So if Pyongyang changes policy orientation, I was remember more than 10 years ago, the Kim Jong-il then suddenly says that United States was a natural partner for North Korea like that. Then such kind of discourse come back. I think that I bet you.
Chihoko, final word?
Yeah, so what are the hopes for a six-party talks 2.0, essentially, right?
Yeah.
The situation has evolved not just in North Korea's own capabilities, but also the relationship that each country has with North Korea. Japan, of course, is the only country amongst them that hasn't had a bilateral with Pyongyang, but there is no real united front in what is expected from North Korea, and I don't think the increased tensions and increased capabilities has actually led to a greater united front. In fact, I think it's actually become more divisive, and certainly tensions between Japan and Korea, South Korea's own evolved relationship with the North has made it much more difficult to put that into the calculus for unity.
Well, we promised a discussion of unbalanced relations. I think we may have also touched on disharmony and maybe also a tipping point, to extend the metaphor probably too far. I want to thank both of you. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I want to remind everybody to look for Dr. Iwashita's paper, which will come out as a Canon cable sometime in the next couple of weeks. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you for the questions. Thanks to the audience. I know it's late in Japan. It's early on the East Coast of the United States. So we will be putting this recording out online as well. Again, thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.